all my paranormal misfits, and welcome to the Paranormal Misfit podcast. I am your host, Chrissy, and I'm here to talk about all things paranormal and spooky. From experience that I or someone else has had, to the shows, movies, and books, to lores and legends, and to the places known for the paranormal. I'm going to talk about all of it. I myself am a believer with a healthy set of skepticism. You'll hear my thoughts and feelings about different topics revolving around the paranormal, so cozy up with your favorite beverage of choice and listen along. Good evening, everyone. You got your favorite drink ready and a nice little comfy spot going, because tonight we are going back to hauntings and back to some more local lore, basically. So tonight, I've decided to cover, which I'm sure there's been a lot of coverage on it over the years, but it's the Villisca Axe Murder House. So, excuse me while I take a sip of my drink. All right, let's go. So, a couple of different places I pulled from my sources. One of them is Legends of America. This person has their own blog. They kind of travel around the U.S. and, just give you all the stuff, give you all the information. So on a quiet residential street in a small town of Villisca, sorry, finally got this bug that's been bothering me. Villisca, Iowa, a horrible tragedy that continues to leave its effects on this small town that occurred a century ago. The walls of this pristine home still protect the identity of a murderer who bludgeoned the entire family of Josiah Moore and two overnight guests on June 10, 1912. Moreover, not only do her walls hold secrets of the killer these many years later, but they also continue to house several paranormal entities. So nestled in the hills of southwest Iowa, Villisca is a small rural community of about 1,300 people today, but in the early 1900s, it was actually a bustling railroad town of about 2,500 people. At the time, more than 24 passenger and freight trains stopped by the Daily Depot. Ooh. And the town sported several hotels, restaurants, stores, theaters, and manufacturers. Josiah B. Moore, one of Villisca's most prominent businessmen, lived in this thriving environment. Ooh. The owner and operator of Moore Implement Company, a John Deere company franchise. He was a solid competitor with other area businesses. On December 6, 1899, I said that right. Yeah, 1899. Okay. Josiah married Sarah Montgomery at her parents' home, and the couple would then have 4 children: Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. Let's see. JB, as Josiah was familiarly called, sorry, that went kind of weird, and his wife Sarah were well liked in the community, active in the Presbyterian Church, and described as being friendly and helpful to their neighbors. On Sunday, June 9th, 1912, the Moore family and the Stillinger family, attended church. The annual event was also held Sunday evening, called Children's Day program, that had been coordinated by Sarah Moore. That evening, 9-year-old Catherine Moore invited her friends, 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and her sister, 7-year-old Ina May, for a sleepover. The girls accepted, and after the program ended at 9:30, the Moore family and the Stillinger family sisters walked home from the church, arriving at about between 9:45 and 10 p.m. at home. The following day, Moore's neighbor, Mary Peckham. Oh my God, there is a bug. I hate Florida, guys. Sorry, I had to take another drink. Okay. Moore's neighbor, Mary Peckham, noticed the Moores were not outside taking care of their regular chores and that the house was unusually still. She knocked on the door between She knocked on the door between 7 and 8 a.m., but received no answer. When she tried to open the door, she found it locked. Concerned, she called Josiah's brother Ross Moore. When Ross Moore arrived, he knocked loudly on the door and shouted, attempting to raise someone inside the house. And then he tried to look through the windows, but found all the curtains were drawn or the windows were covered. He then produced his keys. Why didn't you just produce your... You know what? Never mind. He then produced his keys and entered the house, quickly returning to the front porch and instructing Mary Peckham to call the sheriff. What he had seen was shocking. The entire Josiah Moore family had been murdered, as well as the two young overnight guests, all bludgeoned with an axe while they slept. In the upstairs master bedroom laid 43-year-old Josiah Moore and 39-year-old Sarah Moore, both bludgeoned in the head, their bed linens heavily stained with blood. In the adjacent upstairs bedrooms were the Moore children, 11-year-old Herman, 10-year-old Mary Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul, who all had been bludgeoned in the head while they slept. In the main level guest room, the bodies of Lena Stillinger, 12, and her sister Ina, age 8, were found dead, killed like the family. Villisca City Hall Marshal Hank Horton arrived quickly, soon followed by other officers. In the meantime, the gruesome news spread like wildfire, and within no time, the neighbors and curious onlookers converged on the house. Law enforcement quickly lost control of the crime scene, as that always seems to happen in about this time period. And it said that it had as many as 100 gawkers strolling through the house before the Villisca National Guard arrived around noon and basically cut off the house. The investigation tells that the 8 victims were likely killed shortly after midnight, and all but Lena Stillinger were thought to have been asleep at the time of their murders. It was concluded that Lena was the only victim that had attempted to fight off her attacker, as she appeared to have defensive wounds on her arm. The attack was so vicious that the ceilings in the parents' and the children's bedrooms showed gouge marks made by the upswinging of the axe. The axe was found in the guest bedroom, indicating the Stillinger girls were the last to be killed. It was bloody, but an attempt had been made. Why, I don't know. An attempt had been made to... Where did it go? To wipe it off. The axe belonged to Josiah Moore. All of the curtains in the house had been drawn. 2 windows that didn't have curtains had been covered by clothing. All of the victims' faces were covered with bed linens or clothes after being killed. Evidence showed that a pan of bloody water was discovered at the kitchen table and a plate of uneaten food. No one could imagine who could commit such a heinous crime, and the townsfolk were first convinced it must have been a deranged tramp, expecting to find a blood-drenched killer hiding somewhere in the area. Several posses were formed on horseback and in autos, searching alleys in the city and every barn, shed, and outhouse nearby, but they returned empty-handed. With darkness came the fear that a madman was on the loose, might strike again. Families partnered with neighbors to stand shotgun guard all night, and windows were nailed shut. In the ensuing days, every lock in town was sold out. Residents openly carried weapons. Neighbors looked suspiciously upon neighbors, and rumors and accusations ran rampant. Soon, newspaper reporters and private detectives flooded the streets. Bloodhounds were brought in, and law enforcement agencies from neighboring counties and states joined forces. The murders began a chain of events that split the small town and forever changed the life of its residents. Sorry, guys. One of the earliest thoughts by investigators was the possibility of a serial killer. The previous year, a series of horrible murders occurred in the Midwest. In the fall of 1911, whole families were slaughtered in their beds every 2 weeks without an apparent reason. These included families such as the Burnhams and the Waynes in Colorado Springs in September. The killing of a family in Monmouth, Illinois, 2 weeks later, accumulated in the murder of the Showman family in Kansas on October 15th, 1911. The next year, a similar murder occurred in Kansas on June 5th, 1912, just 4 days before Villisca. Despite the similarities in the gruesome killings, the interest in the serial killer theory soon faded and was largely forgotten. Whew. Every stranger or transient to this small town was also a suspect. One such man was Andy Sawyer, a transit who moved from job to job. He gained temporary work for the Burlington Railroad on the morning of the murder. According to the rail crew, he purchased a newspaper that headlined the murders and was much interested in it. The crew also complained that Sawyer slept with his clothes on with an axe nearby and was a loner. Afterward, he talked much about the Villisca murders and whether or not a killer had been apprehended. He also told the crew foreman that he had been in Villisca that Sunday night and was afraid he might be a suspect, so he left. The crew's foreman, Thomas Dyer, was suspicious and turned him over to the sheriff on June 18th, 1912. The foreman would later testify that before he turned Sawyer over to the authorities, he walked up behind him and Sawyer was rubbing his head with both hands. Suddenly, he jumped up and said to himself, "I will cut your goddamn heads off," while making striking motions with his axe and hitting the piles before him. Sawyer's name often came up in grand jury testimonies. He was eventually dismissed as it was found he was actually in Osceola, Iowa on the night of the murder. The alibi was very tight as he had been arrested for vagrancy at 11 p.m. that evening. As the investigation continued, the focus turned to locals in the community and several possible suspects emerged. The speculation of the townspeople caused them to identify themselves by who they believed committed the crime. Friendships became strained and, in many cases, broken. One of the first suspects was Sarah's brother-in-law, Lee Van Gilder, who was her sister's ex-husband, Mary, a man prone to violence and having previous brushes with the law. There was bad blood between him and the family. Van Gilder, however, was later cleared. Looking for a motive, the authorities began investigating Frank F. Jones, a prominent businessman and Iowa state senator. For years before he opened his business, Josiah Moore had worked for Frank Jones as top salesman in Jones of Villisca, a hardware and implement store. In 1907, Josiah left the company and started a competing business, taking the coveted John Deere franchise with him. The two became bitter enemies, so much that by 1910 they wouldn't speak and crossed the street to avoid meeting each other. Not believing that Jones would commit the crime himself, investigators began to look at a man named William Mansfield, who, from a tip, had learned Senator Frank F. Jones might have hired him to murder the Moore family. In July of 1916, Mansfield was arrested in Kansas City, Kansas, and extradited to Iowa to face the Montgomery County Grand Jury. Though local opinion anticipated Mansfield would be bound over for trial, the jury refused to indict him because his alibi was checked out. In the meantime, Frank Jones lost his re-election as senator, but was never charged with the crime. Another suspect was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister who happened to be teaching at the Children's Day services at the Presbyterian Church, which the Moore family attended on June 9th. The tiny, nervous, bird-like creature had a reputation for being unbalanced and perhaps a pedophile, and had left Villisca early on the day of the murder. It was not these facts, however, that led him to being investigated. It was rather an obsession he had had with the murder that turned law enforcement's eyes on him. His obsession resulted in a stream of long, rambling letters sent to the state and local investigators, private detectives, and relatives of the victims. On his next preaching visit to Villisca 2 weeks after the crime, he arranged to stay over on Monday and visit the murder house. Within a month, officials began investigating him, finding out that he had been sneaking into the women's bathroom just days before the murder and had been observed in several towns prowling the streets late at night. He had also requested that young women pose nude for him on at least 3 occasions. They also cited a disturbed mental state, including a sexual obsession and a bloody shirt he sent to be laundered the week after the murder. Kelly was arrested in April of 1917. As the trial drew near, state officials decided on one final all-out effort to get him to confess. After a long evening of interrogation, Kelly dictated a confession on August 31st, 1917. The confession stated he had difficulty sleeping the night of the murder night and went for a walk, during which he spied on the Stillinger girls getting ready for bed through a window. He then heard the Lord's voice commanding him to suffer the children to come unto me. The trial began September 4th, 1917, but was dismissed by September 28th, as the jury was deadlocked 11-1 for an acquittal. The second trial happened in November and resulted in Kelly being acquitted of all charges. By the time trial began, most Montgomery citizens were convinced that Kelly was framed as part of a conspiracy led by Frank Jones. They believed Jones had tried using his money and influence to pack the jury. Another suspect was Henry Lee Moore, but he's not related to Josiah Moore, who was thought to be a serial killer. Several months after the Villisca murder, Henry was convicted of the murder of his mother and grandmother with an axe. He was also suspected of the killings in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and Ellsworth and Poloa, Kansas. The cases were similar enough that the same person committed all. However, this was never proven. In the end, the police and investigators gave up in 1917. The murders remained unsolved and the killer went unpunished. Today, the remains of those murders, those murdered by the mysterious axeman in Villisca, lie in Villisca Cemetery. The murder house continues to stand. The house where the murders occurred was initially built in 1868, and the Moore family purchased it in 1903. After their deaths, the house went through a possession of 8 people until Mr. and Mrs. Darwin Lynn purchased it in 1994. By 1994, though, the house had been deteriorated badly and was nearly condemned. However, the Lynns restored the old house into its original condition, and in 1998, it was actually added to the National Registry of Historic Places. Today, it is open for tours and overnight sleepovers. It should come with no surprise that it is haunted, so much that it is consistently rated the top 10 most haunted places in America. Over the years, the house has had a long history of paranormal happenings. Previous tenants have said that they have spied a shadowy man with an axe standing at the foot of their beds, images of bloody shoes, closet doors that open to their own device, the sounds of children crying, and clothing taken from dressers and closets and strewn about the room. In one instance, a man reported while sharpening a knife, I would not be doing, it suddenly turned around and stabbed him in the thumb. He explained that it had felt as if someone had grabbed his wrist. One family reportedly ran out of the house screaming one night and moved out that day. It is a really nice looking house. I wouldn't buy it, but you know. Since the house was open to tours and overnight stays, several paranormal investigations have been conducted which have allegedly provided audio, video, and photographic proof of the paranormal activity. When the house was investigated by Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures crew, they captured a recording of a man who said, "I killed 6 kids." Yet others who have toured the house have reported hearing children's voices when there are none present, whispers, banging sounds, falling lamps, and objects that move on their own accord. Let's see. Some have reported feeling an evil presence in the attic, where it is thought the murderer hid while waiting for the family to fall asleep. One story alleges that an unknown force prevented her as one individual tried to enter the attic. Though many say that the house is truly haunted, there are many who say it is not, including those who have lived in the house without ever experiencing any mysterious activities. Let's see. There is a movie, just so you know. While I was looking for my information, it's called Villisca. Let's see, on the Rotten... Gotta love some Rotten Tomatoes. Let's see, on Rotten Tomatoes, it was rated 14%, and the audience score was about 13%. The movie was made in 2016. Ooh, sorry guys, and it is about an hour, a little under an hour and a half. You can check it out on Vudu, Prime Video, and Apple TV. Let's see. So the movie info is obviously on a June night in 1912, 8 people were murdered by an axe-wielding killer in the sleepy town of Villisca, Iowa. Case remains unsolved to this day. More than a century later, Caleb and Denny, 2 friends who shared interest in ghost hunting, along with Jess, a new girl in school who had already had a reputation, sneak into the house where the infamous bloodbath occurred in hopes of recording paranormal activity. And that's all it says on that. Let's see. You can go to the official Villisca Axe Murder House website. It gives you the prices of the overnights and tours that they do around. Let's see. Day tours will open April 1st, 2023. Overnight bookings are year-round. Overnight pricing is $428 for a group of 1 to 6 people, $75 for each additional person, $200 non-refundable deposit when you pick the dates, and that deposit does go towards your full amount. So, has anyone stayed there? It seems interesting. I don't know if I would be someone who would stay there. But you never know. I could finally get some gumption and do it. All right. So on the website, they do have a little area called, what did I just click on? I think it's people's experiences. All right. So here's one. That's a big one. So, summary of my personal experience at the Villisca Murder House by Pat Busen of Waukesha, Wisconsin. I hope I said that right. My first visit to the Villisca Murder House was June of 2009. It was a simple day tour to the house and the cemetery, but since that day I've been hooked. Since that time I've spent many overnight visits at the house, and not one time have I any regrets. As far as paranormal activity goes, this house comes through loud and proud. Over the past few years, I've accumulated many EVPs from this house, both live and residual. I have also called out the names of the Moore children and Lena and Ina Stillinger, who are all victims of that fateful night, to turn my flashlight on and off when asked questions, and they did just that. These impressive paranormal incidents occur in the Blue Room, which is where Lena and Ina were murdered, and the upstairs bedroom where the 4 more children were murdered. I have felt cold spots in this house that I cannot offer an explanation to, but they're there. Based on my personal experience in the EVP captures, along with my own gut feeling, I believe spirits of all 8 victims still dwell in that house. But the burning question is why? Is it due to the fear and trauma as a result of the incident itself, or is it because the house is the last place they knew? Could it be all of the above or none of the above? A couple years back, I became a member of a paranormal investigation team called the International Ghost Research Society, IGRS. And we have spent a few overnights at the house gathering plenty of audio and video evidence to convince even the most hardcore skeptic that the Villisca Axe Murder House is most definitely haunted. This house has a mystique all on its own and will rival any other alleged haunted locations. An overnight visit to this house will make most skeptics believers come sunrise the next morning. What happened in that house of June of 1912 was terrible and tragic. It was something that should have never happened, and I believe there are many secrets embedded within the town of Villisca concerning the axe murders that may have never be revealed. In closing, I am glad to discover the Villisca Murder House as a paranormal investigation hotspot and a place to remember the victims as well. I look forward to many more memorable visits. Let's see. They have a little, that's a video. There are a few YouTubes, videos that it takes you to for the evidence of like the different paranormals that happen at the Villisca. I haven't watched them, obviously. So let's see if there's anything else. I have watched, and I think, was it early season? I think it's early season of the Ghost Adventures who did go to the Villisca Murder House. I'm not gonna lie, I'm drawing a blank on whether or not Ghost Brothers did or not. Let's go up here. So in popular culture, yeah. So Ghost Adventures have there's a that's gonna come out. Sorry, everyone. My youngest kind of came bursting in to tell me about some horror movie stuff. So yeah, we have Ghost Adventures who covered the Villisca Axe Murder House. The murders were described in episode 19. Cover the mirrors of the podcast Scared to Death on January 15th of 2020. Paranormal reality television series Scariest Places on Earth have also covered the Villisca House. The case was profiled on the television series Most Terrifying Places in America. There is also murders were also described in episode 16 of podcast Lore by Aaron Mankey. I hope I said your last name right. I'm sorry. The murders were described in episode 168 of podcast My Favorite Murder. And then episode 21 of another podcast, sorry guys, of And That's Why We Drink. Destination Fear also filmed at the location for their 8th episode of their 3rd season. The murders and the interview with the caretaker Johnny Hauser is featured on the 1st episode of the podcast Haunted Road with Amy Bruni. And it was also investigated by Bruni Adamberry and the psychic Chip Coffey for the episode of Kindred Spirits. Morbid, the podcast Morbid, covered the Villisca Murder House, episode 271. BuzzFeed Unsolved Supernatural did their own paranormal investigation, season 7, episode 2. Crimes of the Centuries podcast covers it, episode 28. Let's see. And yeah, that's about it. So tell me what you think, guys. So I think it's haunted. I absolutely do think it's haunted. I think when tragedy happens in locations, that sometimes spirits bind to that place, and they, I won't say stuck, but they still reside there, right? Like, who knows? Maybe they're stuck, maybe they're not. Maybe they're willingly there, maybe they're not willingly there. And I actually cover a little bit about that topic while talking to Chad from the Dr. Ghost Hunters, which you'll see that episode later, I believe, in about September or October. Fantastic investigation group. Highly recommend them. You can definitely catch them on Instagram. They're super active, and it's their YouTube channel. And their YouTube channel, I really do like their YouTube channel. I do like their scientific approach to investigating. But yeah, so tell me what you think. And also, if you have watched the movie, tell me if it's worth watching, because a 14% definitely scares me on wanting to watch the movie, because I've watched a couple of disasters lately. So just looking for an up. But anyways, that's the end of this episode, guys. I hope you really enjoyed it. You can always still catch me on Instagram, Paranormal Misfits. You can find me on there. You can send me an email through Gmail. Same thing, Paranormal Misfit Pod. Is it pod or podcast? Hold on, let me check for you. You can send me an email, Paranormal Misfit Pod. Catch me on Instagram. You can leave me a DM, a comment, or anything like that. If you'd like for me to cover a certain subject, a certain lore, a certain haunting, cryptid, movie, just drop me a line, let me know, and I will wholeheartedly do it for you, okay? And if you want to share any stories on the podcast, please let me know. You can either send them to me, or we can set you up and you can come and talk on the show. Other than that, I hope you guys all have a great evening and stay spooky. Well, that concludes this episode of the Paranormal Misfits. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on whichever platform you're listening to on. And give me a follow on Instagram at Paranormal Misfit. If you have your own spooky paranormal story you'd like to share or want to hear about a particular lore, place, or whatnot, please feel free to drop me a DM in Instagram. And on that note, I will catch you all later at the next episode, my ghouls.